May 9, 1980, a group of 5 armed men turned the streets of California into an active war zone, transforming an ordinary armed robbery into a blood-soaked shootout, leading to the deaths of 3 individuals and severely wounding 11 officers. All hope seemed lost in the eyes of innocent civilians as the robbers terrorized the city and dominated the local law enforcement officers with their endless firepower. With bullets flying and police vehicles being destroyed, the armed men, led by George Smith, became an unstoppable force that showed no signs of stopping their wrath, filling the streets with blood and lead.
It's a green van. It's 4th and Hamner. They are shooting. Officer hit. Clear the air.
This is the Norco Shootout. The state of California gained a status of notoriety during the 1970s as its cities began seeing an uptick in robberies and gang violence. Among them was Los Angeles, which quickly became the capital of crime and drug distribution. But criminal activity wasn't the only thing on the rise. As California began suffering from the plague of cults and radical Christian groups that began garnering thousands of followers from all across the nation, spreading their extremist views about the end times and how the government needed to be overthrown to save the nation from damnation. As time went on, the residents of the cities became numb to the sight of crime and chaos, making the life of misery their new normal. Among these residents was George Wayne Smith from Orange County. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, George lived in a state of constant paranoia. Seeing neighboring cities like Los Angeles go up in flames was nothing but an ordinary Tuesday for young George. On top of that, the rise in tensions of the Cold War elevated George's belief that the end times were near, though the paranoia did not get the best of him, as George enlisted himself in the U.S. Army right after graduating from high school, hoping that he could contribute towards the protection of his country from the Soviets. Since the Cold War had a high potential for starting a nuclear war, George was trained to be an artilleryman, responsible for launching battlefield nukes in the enemy territories. Instead of taking away his paranoia, the constant nuclear tensions between the US and the Soviets increased his doomsday beliefs tenfold. Yet, he was still able to keep his sanity intact and managed to serve 2 years in the military before being honorably discharged. After leaving the military, George returned to his hometown and started working as a maintenance man in Cypress, California. With high hopes in mind, George began making plans for his new life. However, before he could make any plans, he started noticing some members of his community attending sermons held by preachers who talked about the end of the world and spreading the word of God. In a state of curiosity, George began attending these sermons on a weekly basis, not knowing that he would soon become a member of a radical doomsday group. The more time he spent with the group, the more extreme his beliefs became, eventually embracing the idea of an upcoming rapture, and he began arming himself with weapons that would help him survive the apocalypse. But George wasn't the only one going down the doomsday spiral, as he began influencing his colleague at work, Christopher Harvin. Just like George, Christopher also served in the military and wanted to make an honest living for his family. But after becoming close friends with George, his life took a complete 180. During their hangouts, George began brainwashing Christopher with his beliefs about the end of the world through nuclear warfare and how the government had left America in ruins. Christopher wasn't a follower of any extremist churches or a strong believer in God, but due to his service in the military, the civil unrest in the country, and the high possibility of nuclear war, it influenced him to believe in George's doomsday beliefs. Both men eventually began making preparations for the future doomsday event and decided to buy a house together in Myra Loma, leaving behind their earthly possessions and only taking what was necessary for survival. Knowing that no one other than themselves would believe in the soon-to-be apocalypse, the duo left their families behind and quit their jobs. What started as delusions soon became a reality, as George and Christopher barricaded themselves in their new safe haven and formulated plans on how to survive the end times. In order to finance their plans for survival, the duo started growing marijuana on their property, but due to the lack of connections and understanding of the drug trade, the business soon failed, steering George away from the life of survival and towards the life of crime. With nothing left to lose and no hope for the world, George and Christopher decide to rob a bank, which would result in a bigger payday and finance their survivalist lifestyle for decades. Little did anyone know that these survivalists turned criminals were soon going to become a living nightmare for the city of Norco. George realized that in order to execute a successful robbery, it was going to take more than two people. The duo began targeting acquaintances and close family members that could be easily persuaded into committing crimes with the promise of great fortune. Christopher took the lead in the recruitment process and reached out to three people that he knew were desperate enough to break the law. Among the early recruits was Belisario and Manuel Delgado, two brothers who needed the money to support their families and were given assurances by Christopher that the heist would go smoothly without any repercussions. Later on, Christopher convinced his brother, Russell Harvin, to join the group. The duo took advantage of the recruits' vulnerability and used them as pawns in their grand scheme of eternal salvation. With the manpower ready to go, George started to formulate a plan and tasked each member of the group to gather resources for the heist. George chose the Security Pacific Bank in Norco, California, and visited the branch multiple times in order to understand the layout of the bank's interior. After a week, the blueprints were set and the escape routes were mapped out with clear directions. And in order to stay ahead of the police, George decided to set a timer of 2 minutes for the heist that had to be strictly followed. With a clear goal in mind and making sure no one stood in their way, the group assembled an arsenal that consisted of shotguns, handguns, 9 Armalite rifles, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Meanwhile, George equipped himself with handmade explosives and incendiary bombs that he could use against local authorities and cause massive damages to the properties around them. In order to avoid intervention from law enforcement officers, the Army vet created an IED bomb that he was going to use as a diversion before the heist even began. Since they couldn't use their personal vehicles, Russell Belisario and Manuel Delgado stole a 1979 Dodge van from Barra Mall, which belonged to Gary Herrera, who was kidnapped during the hijacking of the car and was later disposed of at an unknown site. With everything set in place, it was time for George to execute his nefarious plan, which was going to jeopardize the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians in the process. With guns locked and loaded, the robbers drove towards the Norco branch of the Security Pacific Bank. But before they could go in guns blazing, they needed a diversion to distract the local authorities while they executed the heist. George had a building site in mind located south of Norco. The men attached and ignited the IED to the gas main to the building and anticipated a huge explosion, but to their surprise, the explosion failed to detonate. Instead of inspecting the fault in the explosive, the group decided to go ahead with the heist without the diversion and improvise if they ran to local law enforcement. At 3:40 p.m., the robbers covered their faces with ski masks and stormed into the bank, while Belisario stayed behind, acting as the getaway driver. With the timer set for 2 minutes, the group executed their heist. George guarded the entrance while informing his members about the elapsed time, while the rest took control of the crowd and collected the money. With each passing second, the robbers acted with extreme focus. Manuel climbed over the counter with his pump-action shotgun and prevented the bank tellers from pressing the silent alarm button, while Christopher led the bank manager to the vault and began collecting the cash in the bag. As the timer went off, George ordered everyone to leave the building and ready their weapons in anticipation of a firefight with law enforcement. It seemed like the timer was of no use, as a bystander from across the street called the police and reported suspicious activity happening within the bank. The robbers sprinted out of the bank with $20,000 in cash, but before they could make their escape, a patrol car driven by Deputy Bolasky confronted the group in the bank parking lot. Before the deputy could even get out of his car, the group began firing at the vehicle with no hesitation, forcing Bolasky to collide with incoming traffic. But the bullets did not stop the deputy from fighting back, as he took out his pump-action shotgun from the patrol car and began firing at the robbers. Chaos erupted on the streets of Norco as both parties exchanged hundreds of rounds while taking cover behind their respective vehicles. In fear of backup arriving, the group entered the getaway car and tried to make a run for it, but the robbers' poor judgment gave Bolasky an opportunity to hit his targets with accuracy. The deputy rapidly fired at the getaway vehicle, hitting George in the groin and Belisario in the neck, killing him instantly and causing the vehicle to collide with a nearby fence. Luckily for Bolasky, 2 officers, Chuck Hilly and Andy Delgado, arrived on the scene as backup. Seeing that the vehicle was stuck in the fence and they were sitting ducks in front of the officers, George realized that the only way out was to eliminate the threat and later ordered his men to use their rifles against their aggressors. The high-caliber rounds from the gang's assault rifles overpowered the officers and eventually struck Bolasky in the arm, critically wounding him. Seeing that the deputy was losing a lot of blood, Chuck Hilly dragged Bolasky into his patrol car and took the deputy to a nearby hospital, leaving Andy Delgado to fend for himself. With only 1 officer left to fight and no sign of any other backup, George and the remaining 3 members of the group began looking for a new vehicle to use for their escape. The robbers hijacked a yellow pickup truck from incoming traffic and loaded it with their weapons. Christopher took the wheel with George sitting beside him in the passenger seat, tending to his wounds, while Manuel and Russell stood behind the bed of the pickup truck with their rifles to prevent anyone from getting near the vehicle. What was planned to be a simple robbery was soon going to become Norco City's deadliest shootout, leading to devastating consequences for both the police and the armed men. With clothes soaked in blood and rifles fully loaded, the group was ready to set the whole city on fire. Seeing the growing number of police cars behind him, Christopher drove to the streets of Norco at full speed, running red lights and striking vehicles in the process. As the police got closer, Manuel and Russell readied their sights and began showering the patrol cars with bullets. Chaos began spreading from one neighborhood to the next as local residents were caught in the crossfire with stray bullets piercing their way into multiple households, destroying the image of the one place the residents thought was safe from the horrors of the outside world. Meanwhile, officers took cover in their vehicles as hundreds of rifle rounds grazed their skins and tore through the walls of their patrol cars like paper. The officers' handguns were useless against the robbers' heavy weaponry and ammunition, which had the capacity to mow down whole armies, making the officers realize that the group had become a bigger threat than they had anticipated. In order to keep up with the yellow van and make sure they didn't lose sight of the culprits, the deputies requested air support from the local precinct. A helicopter was later dispatched and followed the van throughout the chase. After noticing that the helicopter was keeping tabs on the getaway vehicle, George ordered Manuel and Russell to focus on the chopper and shoot it down. With a new target in sight, both robbers began shooting the helicopter with their assault rifles and were successful in bringing it down. After seeing the group shoot the chopper down, the officers in pursuit alerted the local airport to shut down, fearing that the men might shoot down civilian aircraft next. The armed men displayed their full power, showing everyone in the city of Norco the consequences of standing in their way. Knowing that there was nowhere close by to escape to, the group began heading toward Lido Creek Canyon in the San Gabriel Mountains, hoping to lose the police and hide within the deep woods of the canyon. Little did the gang know that the mountain terrain was soon going to become their biggest downfall. As the chase continued through the steep roads of the Lido Canyon, many officers abandoned their pursuit due to their vehicles being severely damaged by the bullets of the assault rifles. Yet a few brave officers pushed ahead, despite being ill-equipped and lacking knowledge about the robbers' full arsenal. Upon realizing that only 2 patrol cars were on their tail, George prepared his hand grenade and was ready to throw them towards the remaining officers, but due to the possibility of a landslide, George resorted to a different tactic and used the sharp turns of the canyon road to ambush their pursuers. As the group took defensive positions behind their vehicle, they initiated their surprise attack and began unloading their rifles on the remaining officers. The officers were outnumbered once again and hopelessly fired back while taking cover behind their vehicles. Among the brave officers was Deputy Sheriff Jim Avens, who landed a successful shot on Christopher's back, but before he could take another shot, the deputy's handgun ran out of ammo, which gave the robbers an opening to strike back. While reloading his gun, the young deputy was shot in the right eye and died on the spot. With his partner's lifeless body lying a few feet away from him, it was up to Deputy Daniel McCarty to fight against the 4 heavily armed men. With the dedication to fulfill his duties, McCarty kept his composure and fought back with all his might, making sure that his fallen colleagues were avenged. And unlike the other officers, he had a backup weapon on standby, a fully automatic M16 rifle. While the robbers were reloading their weapons, McCarty began shooting his M16 rifle at the culprits, forcing everyone to hide in the woods. The gang members were severely suffering from their wounds and began losing blood as time went on. As a last-ditch resort, George told the group to rest and wait until morning to make their next move. As the sun began to set, McCarty was soon accompanied by a SWAT team and local police officers. In order to prevent any more ambushes from happening, the officers set up their camps near the woods and patiently waited for any signs of movement. The loss of blood had hindered the group's focus, which made them easy prey for the authorities, who made their way into the woods at the break of dawn. The armed men began making a run for the deeper part of the woods, but it seemed like their luck had finally run out as they were surrounded by SWAT team members who ordered the group to put down their weapons. But unlike the others, Manuel wasn't going down without a fight. Seeing that he showed no signs of surrendering, the officers shot Manuel 4 times, ending the gang's crime spree once and for all.
On May 9, 1980, 5 heavily armed men would commit a robbery at this bank, 2 of the suspects being killed, 1 Riverside County sheriff killed.
The Norco incident showed that we were woefully underarmed. This robbery always comes back to the failure that we don't ever want to have again.
The armed men's carnage left the city of Norco in shock, as the shootout had resulted in 3 deaths and 11 officers being severely wounded. As for the 3 surviving culprits, George Wayne Smith, along with Christopher and Russell Harvin, were convicted of 46 felonies and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The events that transpired in Norco City changed law enforcement in California forever, as the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department began equipping their deputies with stronger and heavier weapons like Ruger Mini 14s, M16s, and AR-15s. But the officers' arsenal wasn't the only thing that was being improved, as the police department upgraded their surveillance helicopters and outfitted them with heavy weaponry like an M60 machine gun. The Irvine Police Department used the Norco robbery as a catalyst for change, producing a training video that showcased appropriate tactics to handle similar situations. The 1980 incident continues to shape anti-terrorism and survival training for law enforcement nationwide, prompting advancements in equipment and refining tactics to enhance officer survival. As for those that had fallen, a lasting tribute was made to Deputy Evans by naming a street Deputy Evans Drive in Norco, which highlights the bravery and sacrifice made by the officer in the pursuit of public safety. After deep diving into the history of the Norco shootout, we wonder how things would have turned out if George Smith never joined the Radical Church, and what would have happened if the officers were properly equipped before the heist even began.